this video is about speech acts, which is a sort of a subcategory within the philosophy of language and really looks at speech as a component of human behavior that can have effects on other people and on the world, mainly by separating speech as an action from the literal content of the sentences that people say. So, when we interpret speech acts, we are not just looking at the literal content of the words and sentences that we use. We have to look at them in context, just like this gesture means one thing when I'm on the phone and I want you to come and maybe take the phone from me and talk to the person I'm talking to. I don't know. It could mean come here. In an action movie, this means I want to fight you, right? Or come get some, or whatever, you know. And the meaning is context dependent, even if the gesture did not change at all. So we have to look at speech acts in context to understand their real meaning, the meaning that they have to us as humans, not just as grammar and vocabulary interpreting machines, right? So to take a very topical example, here's a sentence, and here's another sentence, and we know if we speak English that these are full, complete sentences, so there's a subject and a verb for both of them. But because we're humans living in the United States in this year, it's 2020 at the time that I'm making this, but we interpret these in context as something other than their literal content. So the most neutral interpretation I can give that's still realistic about the way people interpret them in our current political climate is that they're statements of political affiliation. So the first speaker probably means to affiliate him or herself with one political group, and the other speaker means to rebut the other speaker's, not really rebut, but to present a conflicting affiliation. Right? And because we're humans who live in the United States in 2020 and we understand political speech, we know that it wouldn't be bizarre if these two were fighting within the next 5 minutes, or at least, verbally fighting. And again, nothing about the literal content of these two sentences would make that clear. But because we understand speech in context, we know that. Right? So understanding speech acts means looking beyond the literal content of sentences. For their force. And there's some special terminology for that. Locution, illocution, and perlocution. Locution is the literal meaning of sentences. Okay? Now I want to stop you from thinking that the literal meaning of sentences is what they really mean, because nobody is a pure literalist when it comes to understanding language. We always think of context. And I hope some examples will make that clear. But locution is the literal meaning of what was said, not necessarily what people really meant. In fact, definitely not what people really meant. Okay, but if we're just looking at the words and grammar out of context, that's locution. Illocution is the force that something had, the force that a speech act had in the real world. But this is the distinction between these two first categories is mainly what we're interested in this video. Perlocution, on the other hand, is what effects were produced on other people. So people besides the speaker. Okay. So again, the TLDR, too long didn't read, summary of this video is that illocutionary force, that is, the real meaning of sentences is very often different from the literal meaning of sentences. Okay. So to give an example of locution, and I'm giving this without context intentionally because when we talk about locution, we're talking about decontextualized, purely nuts and bolts words and grammar type of meaning. So do you mind is a question, the subject is you, and the speaker wants to ask if you mind, and you can answer yes or no, right? That's without the context. But in context, we'll see that the meaning, and here I mean the illocutionary force, the real meaning of the sentence in context, it depends on that context and can change quite a bit. So let's take the example of this Maiko. They're not really called geisha. They're not called geisha within Japan. They're called Maiko. But anyway, she's walking down the street in Kyoto, minding her own business, and a tourist comes up to her and says, "Do you mind?" Now, this is exactly the same utterance, the same three words as the example from the last slide, but in context, we're going to interpret this quite differently. The illocutionary force is to make a request. So he's asking for her permission to take a picture. And if she, is well, it's not, we can't take for granted that she would be an English speaker in this scenario, but let's say that she is. She'll interpret it that way. She won't interpret it as a decontextualized question to which the only answers are yes or no. And she'll interpret that in the context that it's given, right? And she'll say, yeah, please go away. Or no, I don't mind. Go ahead, take my picture. Okay. Now, if we change the context, we're also going to change the illocutionary force. That is the real meaning of the question in context. So let's change the scenario to a tourist comes up and takes a picture without asking, and then the Maiko says, "Do you mind?" So in this case, the illocutionary force is that of a request still, but a request to leave me alone and go away or stop doing what you're doing. And again, the locution hasn't changed at all. It's the exact same question. I just changed the context, and that changing the context forces us to interpret it differently. Okay. So the illocution stayed the same and the illocutionary force changed. So the last category of the speech act, the last category of the effect, it's not a category, the last aspect of a speech act that we're going to look at is perlocution or perlocutionary force. Again, this is the effect of the speech act on other people. So when she says this, at the very least, she puts the idea in his mind that she doesn't like this, right? That's a perlocutionary effect. And then another one could be she causes him to go away. So the perlocutionary effect isn't necessarily predictable. He could decide that he wants to take pictures anyway, or he could fail to interpret her utterance the way that she intended. But either way, the effect that it has on him is called the perlocutionary effect. Okay. So, just to review, locution is what was literally said. Okay, I'm going to give you another example. So say two robbers are trying to crack a safe, and a police car drives up and says police, and then one robber says to the other police. So the locution is just what was said. Okay, so there's a single noun, police. And we're not looking at the context when we look at locution. We're just looking at exactly what was said. And you're probably getting the feeling that although you need to understand English grammar and vocabulary to understand locution, that's not going to get you all the way to a natural human-like understanding of a speech act. That's illocution. So understanding what the phrase police means in context here means understanding the illocutionary force. So in our last example, so do you mind could be a request for permission, or it could be a command like go away. Police means something very different when the police say it to you in the middle of you committing a crime versus you saying it to your partner who's also in the middle of committing a crime with you. The illocutionary force when the police say police, probably through their speaker, is that of a command. So they're telling you to do something. They're not just announcing who they are. They want you to respond in a particular way. And if you live in American society and watch American movies, you probably know what they want you to do in this case, right? On the other hand, when one robber says it to another, it's not taking the form of a command. The illocutionary force is not, lie down and put your hands behind your back. Not your head behind your back. That would hurt. But it's more like a warning, right? One robber wants to tell the other that the police are here, and what they do after that, I guess depends on their, I don't know if this is like an Ocean's 11 type scenario or what, but it means something very different from when the police say it. Okay. So again, perlocution is the effect of the utterance on other people, and it can vary quite a bit depending on who's speaking and who's talking and other variables within the situation. Usually, at the very least, a perlocutionary effect is to put the idea in someone's head that you want them to do a particular thing or that you think a particular thing. In the case of the robbers and the police, the perlocutionary effect might be putting the idea in their head and causing them to flee, right? And that's just one example. So the police making that utterance is not guaranteed to have that effect, but that's one possible effect. Okay, so the locution, illocution, and perlocution can match in a pretty straightforward way in some cases. So if I say it's cloudy today, and I only mean to inform you of the weather, I don't mean to request you to, cancel our picnic or something like that, then the illocutionary force is derivable from the locution in a pretty straightforward way. And the perlocution, which is just having the effect of putting that idea in your head, is also predictable from what I said. In the case of the priest and the couple from, again, the last video, it's also predictable. So in this case, because it's a performative verb, I now pronounce you, blah, 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 the locution and the illocutionary force have to match, because the definition of a performative is that the verb tells you what the illocutionary force is. The illocutionary force is to declare two people married, right? And the perlocutionary effect is to cause two people to become married. And this is all derivable from the sentence itself, even mostly deprived of context. Now, this isn't always true, as we saw with the Black Lives Matter, All Lives Matter example at the very beginning of the video. Illocutionary force can vary quite a bit, even from locution that is on its surface very similar to other locution. So the same scenario of a priest saying, I now pronounce you husband and wife, would have a different illocutionary force if he said it to two robbers in the middle of a crime. I don't know what the force would be, actually. I think they would just be confused. The illocutionary force would be unknown to anybody in this scenario. And the perlocutionary force would probably be to cause them to leave, again, because somebody saw them. Okay, these are called, by the way, indirect speech acts. So when the apparent illocutionary force doesn't match the actual illocutionary force, or what you would assume is the meaning in context of illocution versus what it actually is, don't match, that's called an indirect speech act. So as we saw in a video a while ago, polite speech is characterized by often saying things indirectly. So if I want you to pass the salt, I might say, please pass the salt, or just pass the salt. And the locution, please pass the salt, pretty directly tells you the illocutionary force, which is to make a request or to make a command. As you get more polite, you might have sentences that literally mean something quite different from a request to pass the salt, like, I sure wonder if someone could pass the salt, which on the surface is literally me just describing my thoughts. I sure wonder. But the illocutionary force is to ask for the salt, same as pass the salt. That's called an indirect speech act. Okay, so again, in the case of these two robbers, if one said, I sure wish you'd stop whistling, the illocutionary force would be different from the literal meaning of that sentence, and that's what makes it an indirect speech act. So that's the end of part one. There will be a part two where I categorize illocutionary force into different categories. So hold on for that.